Tom, you mentioned before the show that you wanted to do some upon further review on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish program, a team that has 2 losses to teams that do not have another FBS win besides Notre Dame.
Yeah, concerning. Because I did not watch, I said on the show Saturday night, I did not watch a single snap of Notre Dame Stanford game. Watched it, concerned, because it's like the vibes I'm getting, and this is also, I think this kind of goes to Oklahoma too. So I don't want to overreact, because this is a situation where both Notre Dame and Oklahoma unexpectedly lose their coaches. And then they hire kind of, I don't want to say emotional, but there's like kind of a rebound aspect to it, where it's like Oklahoma goes and gets Brent Venables, who's never been a head coach, but they're familiar with. And Notre Dame turns to Marcus Freeman, who has never been a head coach, but they're familiar with because he's their defensive coordinator and he's done an excellent job kind of recruiting for them. But you're taking 2 first-time head coaches and throwing them into fires where these programs are expected to win right away. And there's always going to be an adjustment period. And we've seen Oklahoma going through it, whereas now Oklahoma's beating Kansas, and it's a sigh of relief. Like, oh, thank God. Like that's not supposed to be the case. And now this Notre Dame team, as you mentioned, lost to Marshall, and now it lost to a Stanford team. And the alarming thing to me is Stanford's defense has been terrible all season long. And it held Notre Dame to 14 points. Like the Irish just don't really have an answer on offense for anything right now. And I understand that losing Ty Buckner is a blow to them, but I don't think Buckner was great to begin with. So I don't think there's been a huge drop off to Drew Pine. And to me, just the vibes are like, I wrote about it this morning in the Monday After, and you want deeper analysis on it, you can go read that. But, like Lou Holtz left, he retired after having a very successful run at Notre Dame, won a national title in 1988. Things had kind of started to slow down, and he retires, although at the time it was rumored he was trying to go get the Vikings job and didn't end up getting it. Dennis Green got it. But then Bob Davie comes in and has some success at the beginning, but you can kind of see cracks in the foundation. Things fall apart. Ty Willingham comes in, has a couple good seasons, but mostly mediocre to bad seasons. Charlie Weiss comes in, has a couple of good seasons, but mostly bad to mediocre seasons. And like that 13-year period, the thing that stood out was Notre Dame was just losing the teams it's never supposed to lose to. Whereas even when Lou Holtz was losing, it was to teams that were really good. Brian Kelly comes in the first couple of years. Notre Dame's still losing to a couple teams it's not supposed to lose to. But then they get to the BCS title game in 2012, which was probably a little too quick and raised expectations too quickly. A few more years of struggling. But like the last 5 years for Notre Dame, there's been the playoff appearances. But more than that, the teams that Notre Dame is supposed to crush, they crushed. And the talk of every single year of Notre Dame's overrated, that went away because Notre Dame was beating the teams it was supposed to, and its losses were all coming to elite programs like Georgia and Clemson and Michigan and those kind of teams. And now you're in Marcus Freeman's start of his tenure, and his very first game involves Notre Dame blowing a 28-7 lead in the Fiesta Bowl to Oklahoma State. A very good Oklahoma State team, not as bad loss, but still, you blew a lead. You didn't know how to finish. And then this season starts with a loss to Ohio State where you're fine. That's not bad, but you didn't look to be anywhere near the same caliber of team in that game, even if it wasn't a blowout. And then you follow it up with a home loss to Marshall. And then a few weeks later, you're following it up with a home loss to Stanford. And like you said, Chip, 2 teams that had not beaten any other FBS opponents besides Notre Dame. So it's like you're a month and a half into the tenure, and you've lost 2 games that you haven't lost to any, but like the kind of games you haven't lost in the last 5 years. And for me, if I'm a Notre Dame fan, it's like you got to be patient because, again, they're all still kind of learning on the job right now. Marcus Freeman has not had to do this before. But I'd be a little scared. Like, you might be going back into the wilderness that you were for 13 years. And maybe things like, I talked about this the last few years. I often felt like Notre Dame fans were a little to taking for granted what Brian Kelly had done. And I think that they're kind of getting a reminder in the first month and a half of this season that what Brian Kelly did is not something you should take for granted, because it's like in your recent memory, there's a whole lot of mediocre to bad football, and you're kind of starting to see some mediocre to bad football again. And I would just be worried if I'm a Notre Dame fan.
I would chalk it up to, hey, you just need a guy at quarterback. But Brian Kelly never had a guy at quarterback. He had some good, like he had, Ian Book was solid. Like he's had solid quarterbacks, but he hasn't had great. They've just been really fundamentally sound. Like they've been well coached, which is why I think Brian Kelly's a really good coach. Now that LSU got a really good one because he's won at every level along the way, building up those type of programs. So I'm with you. You know, I think the thing to watch out for is that recruiting class, which, what was it, number 2 or 3? Like, if that starts falling apart, if they start losing more, because they did just get a really nice win against BYU. Like, that's a pretty good win. Although now Arkansas just went into Provo and just smoked them. So maybe it's not that impressive, but I still thought it was a good win. I think it is something like to put on the radar. I'm not that concerned yet, but I totally understand what you're saying.